The World Health Organization conducted a survey of 22 countries. They found that across age, sex, and income ranges around the world, the second most common fear was that of death or being buried alive. Today, we're going to look at 3 cases in which someone was buried alive or nearly buried alive. But before we get started, if you're a fan of strange, mysterious medical cases and even a little paranormal, then you've come to the right place because that's what we do. So don't forget to click the like and subscribe buttons and turn on all those notifications so you'll be aware of whenever we load new videos. We try to load 2 to 3 per week, depending on the schedule. So let's get started. In 2015, 16-year-old Nizi Perez was living her best life in Western Honduras. She'd recently gotten married and was now 3 months pregnant. One afternoon, while standing outside of the family home, she began to hear gunshots in the immediate area. But she began to have a panic attack looking for where these shots were coming from, and the panic attack led to her becoming unconscious. When her family found her out front of the home, they noticed that she had a weak pulse and seemed to be barely clinging to life. So they rushed her to their nearby hospital. Once at the hospital, a series of tests were run, and the doctors had discovered that she no longer had a pulse and was declared deceased at that time. Her family began to prepare for her funeral, and she was placed inside of a wooden coffin with a glass pane so that they could see her face one last time. She was then placed inside an above ground tomb, which is commonly seen in areas that are below the water table or they don't necessarily have the means to dig through the hard, dry ground. So the family laid Nizi to rest and prepared to go on about their lives without her moving forward. The day after the funeral, Ms. Perez's husband came to the tomb to pay his respects and mourn. But while he was standing there, he began to hear sounds of screaming and scratching noises. He immediately ran for the cemetery groundskeeper, brought him back to the tomb. So Mr. Perez has the groundskeeper at the tomb, and he's saying, "Am I losing my mind? Do you hear what's going on?" The groundskeeper would later be quoted as saying he heard the screaming and the scratching noises and appeared to be coming from inside Miss Perez's tomb. So during this time, Mr. Perez had gathered up some friends and family members that were nearby the cemetery and started to try to break open the tomb. So they're pounding away at this tomb, trying to get inside of it, hoping that if these noises were coming from inside the tomb, that maybe she was alive and they would have a chance to bring her out. So once they finally were able to break through the cement that makes up the outside of the tomb, they pulled the pine box out. Nizi's cousin recalls seeing that the glass pane that was over Nizi's face was broken. So the family quickly opens up the lid to the coffin and look inside, and they find that Nizi appears to be deceased, but her cousin did note that Nizi felt warm and she thought she felt a weak pulse. Now, for understanding here, I have worked with people in the past who weren't necessarily aware of how to take a pulse. If you use your thumb, you're not taking the pulse of the person you're testing on, you're actually feeling your own pulse. So you're supposed to use your index and middle fingers to test for these pulses. So perhaps her cousin made this mistake. So now if you could imagine being Nizi, if this is what actually happened, if they actually heard her, she wakes up from this catatonic state and finds herself in a dark area locked inside of a box. And at this point, she may even be running low on oxygen. So according to Nizi's cousin, Nizi had scratches and bruises across her face, and her fingertips also had scratches and bruises. So you could imagine she's trying to break through the glass to get air and trying to break through this coffin box, trying to get out. It's a terrifying thought. No one wants to be buried alive. It's a huge fear for so many people. In fact, it is such a large fear and has been such a big problem in the past. Then in one state here in the United States where I've practiced, there are many more requirements to be able to declare death of a patient than there are in some of the other places. One state, in fact, you would have to do a corneal reflex test. You'd have to swab the cornea with a Q-tip. Some places you might have to do it in EEG to discover if there's any brain waves at all. Most places do require EKGs and certain reflex tests. So one of the family members backs their truck up to the tomb, and all together they lift up this coffin and put it on the back of the truck and immediately rush Nizi to the nearest hospital. Once she arrives there, the doctors again do a series of tests, and they find no signs of life. They found no pulse, and they once again declared Nizi Perez deceased. And the doctors would say that there were no signs that she had been alive at all, that they believed she was deceased the first time they came to her hospital. After being declared deceased the second time, Ms. Perez was put back into another coffin and put back into her tomb. So what were those sounds that 2 unrelated people heard coming from inside the tomb? How did Nizi get the marks on her face and fingers? How did the glass in the coffin get broken? Was Nizi really deceased the first time she was placed in the tomb? We may never know. So as far as we know, no more sounds have been heard coming from her tomb. What you see behind me here is what I think of when someone talks about a hospital morgue, and looks pretty similar to what most of them look like that I've been in. In our next story, June Burchell is more familiar with these morgues than most people are. In fact, she has woken up in one of these morgues 2 times and has been declared dead 3 times. Ms. Burchell has been diagnosed with a condition known as cataplexy, and is a similar situation to what we saw in our previous story involving Nizi Perez. A cataplexy is a diagnosis that is closely associated with narcolepsy, which is a sleep disorder that we will discuss in another video. I have a few interesting patient cases involving that. Cataplexy itself involves muscle weakness that is sudden and transient. And by transient, we mean it's there for a very short period of time and it may come and go. Now, during these episodes, breathing rate, heart rate, and blood pressure may drop to undetectable levels through standard means. So that could have led Miss Burchell being pronounced dead 3 times. Now, it is said during these cataplexic events that the patient knows what's going on and can hear what's happening. So Miss Burchell would have heard people saying that she is deceased, but is unable to communicate that she is alive and well. And then 2 of those times, she was sent on to the morgue. So she's lying there nude in a refrigerated cabinet surrounded by other dead people, and is finally able to start moving and trying to get out of this dark cabinet. Now, as the story goes, the 3rd time that she was pronounced dead, some other physicians had noticed that she had been through this in the past and went through some further detective means to find out that she was indeed still alive. And she would go on to say that she would rather be dead than be buried alive, which is understandable. Now, over the past couple of years, and newer drugs have come to the market, cataplexy and narcolepsy are becoming more understood. And so these events may not be quite as frequent as they once were. I'm pretty regularly asked about my best and worst cases in medicine. For me, my worst cases deal with children and infants that are sick or injured. My best cases, on the other hand, are cases where children are better and we can discharge them from the hospital. This next case involves a newborn, and it occurs in the Mexican city of Puebla in the year 2020. Now, there are a few things to discuss before we get into the details of the story. When we refer to the gestation period, that's how long the baby is carried by the mother before birth. The gestation period for humans is usually about 40 weeks. Now, if you've been in any of my classes or we've done any kind of medical training, then you'll know I always look for that golden number being 28 weeks. 28 weeks of gestation is when we consider the baby healthy enough to be able to survive outside the womb without any kind of intervention, really. Now, any time before that 40-week period is considered to be premature. And the most premature baby that I've ever dealt with was born at 24 weeks of gestation. So in this case, the baby is born at 23 weeks of gestation. Still the same situation. There's not enough of what we call surfactant to help the lungs to stay open and resist the surface tension of water. So the baby was likely in some type of respiratory distress. When doctors checked on the baby, they were noted as saying there were no vital signs. So they did declare the baby deceased. They alerted the parents. The father came to the baby before the baby was taken away to the morgue, and he swaddled the baby, wrapped it in several blankets. So they take the baby down, and as we've seen in earlier cases here that we've talked about, in the morgue, there are refrigerated cabinets that the bodies are placed in. So the baby was placed inside one of these cabinets, where it was reported to have stayed for about 6 hours. Some of the morgue workers said that they did hear sounds coming from the cabinet. They didn't investigate right away. So when the people from the funeral home arrived to pick up the baby's body, the morgue workers took the baby out, still wrapped into blankets, and noticed that the baby was moving. And that's when they called for immediate help. They got the doctors and nurses involved, and they found that the baby was doing well, a bit cold, but they believe those blankets the father wrapped around the baby kept it alive for those 6 hours. Now, there is a viral video that shows the father holding the baby swaddled in blankets. He's singing to the baby, he's talking to him, he's praying with him. I chose not to share that video here because there's some sensitive pictures. You're welcome to look them up on your own if you like. The last report from the hospital is the baby was doing well, had some strong vitals. He's in an incubator in the neonatal intensive care unit, the NICU. Now, will there be any long-term complications from being in the refrigerator for 6 hours? That's not really known right now. Of course, you have to wait and see as the baby starts to grow and develop. But would there be any complications from being born at 23 weeks of gestation instead of being at full term? That remains to be seen as well. We're going to have to wait and see how the baby develops. But that's going to do it for today's cases. Just want you to know, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch us. This was a little venture that my son asked me to start with him, so telling some of my stories, and he wanted to show off some of his editing techniques. Now, this video, of course, he didn't have time to edit this one, so you're going to see in the future, these are probably going to look a lot better than the way I edit them. In fact, there is one small mistake besides all the other bigger mistakes in this video. If you can find that little mistake and be the first to comment about it, I'll pin your comment up at the top there. And also, don't forget to click like and subscribe, turn on all those notifications so you'll know when we post new videos. So really appreciate it, guys. Thanks for watching.